Well, hey everybody, and welcome to the May episode of Cloud Builder Live. We've got so much going on in the cloud. It's crazy. And I want to take this month and I want to focus on working with Azure developers to help you get a hold of Azure Bicep if you haven't yet, because I think this is an essential tool. Now, you may be noticing this is the second in a row that we've done on Azure. We had a great episode last month looking at container apps, and as a hint, we'll kind of touch container apps again for this episode. But don't worry, we're going to be switching over to GCP in the next episode, so stay tuned to learn more about that. We did some great AWS episodes in the beginning, but really no matter which platform you're on, the goal for Cloud Builder Live is the same, right? We want to be able to help you actually build real solutions in the cloud instead of just knowing about cloud services. Because one of the things when I talk to developers, again, they just say, man, it's hard once I get a certification or I'm just trying to get into a platform and there's so many different ways to do things. How do I know if I'm doing it the right way? And that is a totally valid question. So here's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to be talking about this concept of Azure Bicep. And don't worry if you don't know yet what I'm talking about, because I'm just going to kind of try to break it down for you piece by piece in the beginning. But first, I do want to call out that if you haven't watched last month's episode, I would highly encourage you to go back and do that. Now, part of the reason I say that is I'm going to be building off of some of the concepts of what we did last month in this episode today. So if you haven't, you can go grab that on YouTube. You can go back and watch it and just dive in and totally see how we deployed a container app using Azure Container Apps. And you also can see why I'm so excited about that service and what it can mean for developers in the future. Also here, we're going to have all of the code and some instructions for this episode are going to be in the GitHub repository for this episode. So we'll be posting that here in just a bit so you can get access to that repository and kind of follow along. That's going to have a couple of steps in there that you will need as well. So don't worry, don't feel like you have to try to copy everything down while I'm doing it. You will get the instructions, you will get the bicep templates that I'm going to be building out here. You'll get all of that then. So don't worry. But let's talk first a little bit about what we did last month. So I went through and actually built an Azure Container App. And I did all of this in the console or in the portal, right? So I went into the portal, I created a new container app, we created a new, ACR, and we went through and we, pushed our container to it, our container image to it, and then we brought it into container apps and it was great. Everything worked, but there's a problem because most applications that you build in the cloud, you don't just build one thing, right? You're going to maybe leverage a container that's going to be running and it's going to need to access Cosmos DB, or you're going to need to have something or a function app that responds to Service Bus and maybe all of those things together. And so we need a way that we can orchestrate all of our cloud infrastructure at one time. Now, there's a lot of tools that exist to do this. One of those tools that exists and is phenomenal is a tool called Azure Resource Manager. So this is the deployment and management service for Azure. And this really helps you, again, creating, updating, deleting resources in your Azure account. It does this for you. Now, this actually works using something called ARM templates that are JSON based, and you'll get a chance to look at those later in this very episode. But I don't want to show them to you right now because I don't want to get you too confused on anything yet. But this is a JSON based resource definition that is declarative. So what we do with Azure Resource Manager, we don't say, hey, go create this and then run this command and then go create that. What we do is we define the state of our cloud infrastructure. And we let Azure Resource Manager worry about what it needs to create, what it needs to delete, what it needs to edit to make it meet the state that we've defined. Now, here's the problem though. When you work within these JSON-based templates, it can get a little difficult. They're hard in some ways to really kind of look at first sight and be able to clearly just see the resources that are being defined. And there are other infrastructure as code tools that have become extremely popular in the cloud. Probably the most popular would be Terraform. Now, one of the advantages of Terraform is that it works across multiple different cloud providers using what are called adapters. Now, I think Microsoft looked at that and said, the experience of writing Terraform using this HCL DSL or domain specific language that they have for Terraform, like we want to kind of give our Azure developers something similar on Azure so that they can build these templates themselves, but in a way that's much more efficient and gives you some additional capabilities than just building in ARM templates directly. And so ultimately that's what led to Azure Bicep. And this is a domain-specific language that uses declarative syntax to deploy Azure resources. And this gives us concise syntax, and trust me, nobody ever accused JSON of being concise. So this is different, as you'll see in a bit. It also gives us reliable type safety and support for code reuse. And later on, kind of towards the end, we will be talking a lot about code reuse because I think that's one of the great benefits that we get when we're looking at Azure Bicep. So we've done a lot of talking. We've kind of talked about why this is something that's important. But I want to dive in and really help you start to understand the specifics of how you work with Azure Bicep. So let me just go ahead and quickly run through some things that you need to know. So first of all, in terms of prerequisites here, you're going to need to have an Azure subscription. It's going to be valuable for you to have your own subscription so you can go in and you can try out the things that I'm going to be building here with some Bicep templates. Also here, ideally you have VS Code. We're going to be using the Microsoft provided extension for VS Code that we'll install here in just a minute. And also here, you need to have the Azure CLI and the Bicep CLI. Now, if you don't have the Bicep CLI, don't worry. That's just going to be a single command if you're running a recent version of the Azure CLI where you can get that installed. And I'll walk you through that here in just a bit as well. So with all of that said, and you can see kind of where we're going with this, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and bring up my terminal here. So here we go. So I've got it pulled up and I'm in a directory that I've already prepared for this. You'll see why later, but if I go and list this directory, there's nothing in there. So we truly are starting from scratch. Now, the first thing that I want to do here is I'm going to run, hold on one second here. I am going to run a command that's going to help us get Azure Bicep installed. So if I go ahead and paste this in, AZ Bicep install, and I run this, perfect. We're going to have Azure Bicep installed. Now I can check that it's installed simply by going in and running a command that is going to be, oops, I'm pushing ahead here. It's going to be AZ Bicep and version. Now, when I run this is going to return to us the version, which in this case is the current version 0.6.1. So again, as long as you have the Azure CLI, a recent version, you run AZ Bicep install, you're going to have the tools that you need to work with Azure Bicep. Perfect. So the next thing I'm going to do, which I pasted in just a second ago, is I'm going to create a new resource group. We're going to be working within a resource group here in the beginning, and then we'll use a different one later. This one we're just going to call CBL May 22. That'll just help us distinguish this. Now, I've already logged into Azure here, so this is going to succeed. We're going to be good to go. And this is in a totally just test account. Don't have any other resources in there that I'm actually working with right now. So now that I have that up and running, the next thing I'm going to do is we're just going to go ahead and jump into VS Code, and we'll work on getting it set up with the extension. So I'm going to go ahead and open VS Code, and I'm going to move it over here in the window so you all can see it, and I'm going to make it a lot bigger so it'll show up well on the screen. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go here under the extensions tab, and I'm just going to search here in the marketplace for Bicep. Now, you're going to see one thing come up, and this is going to be the official Azure Bicep extension for VS Code. Now, I can't say this enough, like you need this if you're going to be working with Bicep. You'll see why in just a minute. Now, I already have it installed, so you'll notice here that I only have options to disable and uninstall. So it's already installed here on my machine, so I can close this out and we can actually move forward with actually creating our first Bicep template. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go in and create a new file. We're going to give this the name. We're going to give it a name of storage.bicep. And any time that you create your Bicep template, you're truly just going to end it with the extension .bicep, and that'll let VS Code know that you are indeed working with a Bicep template. Now, so what we have here is we're going to start to define something. Now, the easiest thing to create, just kind of by default here within a Bicep template, is a storage account. So we'll go ahead and we'll give that a shot here. So I'm just going to type resource because I want to create a resource. Now, you can start to see here, it's going to give me some IntelliSense. I'm going to have some ability here to actually see what's going to be needed to create my resource. I'll make the screen even bigger here. Now, what I need to do is actually give this a symbolic name. So we're just going to call this storage account. Now, once we do this, it's going to give us the option to select from all of the different resources that we have to be able to, create in Bicep. So I could go through and scroll through this whole thing. I wouldn't advise it. It's a pretty long list, but I can just go in and type storage, and you can see here that the first thing I have is storage accounts. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. That's only the first half. The second half that I need to select is I need to select the API version that I want to be working with. Now, in this case, and for most cases, you can just select the top item on the list because that's going to be the most recent version that's not a preview or beta version of the API. Great. So now that we have that in place, we can now say, okay, this is the resource that we're going to create. And we're going to go ahead and say that that's going to be equal to, and then we're going to specify all the different parameters that we need to create this particular storage account. Now, you might be saying, okay, I can see there's an error here, and that's because it needs some different settings, which you would expect. The same kinds of things that you would need to create a storage account within the portal, you're going to use here also. So 4 things here, and let me specify this to begin with too. I'm just going to throw this out. In the beginning of this episode, we're going to start off by doing something pretty basic. I'm going to use this to introduce different concepts that you'll need to know when you work with Bicep templates. But once we get past this simple template we're working in the beginning, I'm going to start showing you like real stuff you would see in the wild, stuff you would see if you're on a team that's leveraging Azure Bicep to help deploy more complex applications into the cloud. So just a heads up, if you're like, oh, I already know how to do this, great, hang on, we're going to get there in just a minute. But let's go ahead and give this a name. And so here, again, you can see we have IntelliSense. And so I'm able to come in and say, okay, let me give this a name. We'll call ours, I don't know, CBL May 2022 test. Why not? So now that we have that, the next thing that we need to enter is a kind. Now this is going to be a string value, but you see it actually tells me the available values that I can select from. Well, I want a storage v2 account, so I'm going to go ahead and select that. The next thing I need to do is select location. Now, I created my resource group in East US, so that's what we're going to use here. Now, you're going to notice that it's going to give us a warning here on this, but don't worry, we will fix that later. I'm doing that on purpose here. So the next thing we're going to do is we need to specify a SKU, and this is another one where we're going to have a string value that we need to pass in, and I'm just going to do locally redundant storage, so standard LRS is going to be just fine for me. Okay, so congratulations, you have just created your first Bicep template. Wonderful, yay, everyone cheers. Now, the thing you'll notice here, basically what it's saying here for this warning is you shouldn't use a hard-coded value for this, for the location. And that's true, we'll do something different in a minute, but we're totally not worried with that right now. Now we wanna go through and actually deploy this. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the terminal again. And then from here, we're going to deploy. Now, the way that we deploy this is we're going to say AZ deployment group create. We'll actually pass in the resource group that we just created, and then we're going to tell it about our template file. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on this, and we'll see this start the deployment process. If there's a problem, it'll let us know. Now, what it's showing here in yellow isn't a problem. It's telling us about the warning that it already told us about within VS Code. So again, nothing too crazy here. It's just saying, hey, there's a warning. You should do something different here based on than what you're doing. So this is running. Things always take a little longer to deploy when you're on a demo. That's just the nature of things. So we'll give this just a second to finish up. And then we're going to go take a look in the Azure portal. So it's running. So there we go. We're done with our deployment now. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the browser. And here I've actually got the portal opened up to the resource groups. Let me go ahead and refresh here. Oh, did I log into the wrong subscription? Maybe. Hold on just 1 second and we'll get this going. While I'm waiting, just really quickly in the comments, I want to know how many of you have actually built and deployed infrastructure with ARM templates. So throw that in the comments really quick. Let me know real quick. And I'm going to get this going here in just a second. Okay. So here we actually have our CBL May 22 resource group. That's the one that we created. And down here, you see that we actually have the storage account that we created with our Bicep template, CBL May 2022 test. And we could go into it and we could see that it is East US. It is locally redundant storage, which again, you would expect it is everything that we defined. So everything worked perfectly with our first deployment of a Bicep template. But as you probably suspected, we want to do quite a bit more. So let's go ahead and go back here into VS Code. We're going to do a few things here. The first thing that we need to do is we actually need to handle the little warning that VS Code has given us here. Okay, so here we go. So I see a couple people here saying they're still learning, still working on before they build out ARM templates, and that's totally awesome. And a matter of fact, I'm going to give you a little secret. You guys might miss out on some of the pain that all of us had that we're building these really large-scale ARM templates earlier, because in a lot of ways, it's quite a bit easier now to do that with Azure Bicep. So again, don't worry about not having a lot of ARM experience right now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put in something called a parameter. Now, a parameter is something that we're saying has to be provided for deployment. This can be something where we set a value like we're doing here. We're saying, hey, just use the resource groups location. Whatever that is, that's what you need to use. But also we could set this to just be empty. And if we set this to just be empty, what that would mean is we have to provide a value when we deploy it, or it won't deploy. So we could do that if there's like a variable that we want to pass in. We'll do that later. But for here, what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to the section where we're defining the location, and we're just going to replace this by referencing that parameter. And you notice here that we actually now have our warning go away. So that's great. That's one thing here that we've added in, but I actually want to add in something else. I want to add in another parameter. So we're going to go up here to the top, and I'm going to add in one called environment. Because a lot of times when we're deploying cloud infrastructure, we might have a different environment for, let's say, production versus development. And we don't always want every single thing to be the same. For example, we might want to use, a different storage SKU for production, where maybe we're doing geo-redundant storage as opposed to locally redundant storage. So let's actually use that example here. So if I were to do that, I could now go down here to the SKU name, and we could say, okay, if the environment is equal to dev, then just do standard LRS. But if it's production, then use standard GRS. So this gives us the ability within this template to use conditions to control the values of different parameters that we're using to create a resource. And I'll show you later, we can even use conditionals to go through and define whether or not we deploy a resource in a given deployment. So now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and save this again. And we can go through and deploy this again, because I want to show you what happens when I do this. So I'm just going to go through and run the exact same command that I ran a minute ago. And when I do, you'll notice something here. It's going to take just a second, and then it's going to say, hey, which value do you want for environment? So because we defined that there were a couple of values that we would allow for environment, either dev or prod, it will actually give us an interactive selector during deployment where we can select the one that we want to use. So let's say, yep, I just want to keep doing dev, right? So in which case it'll go through and do the deployment. And what it's going to end up doing is it's going to look at it and say, oh, well, everything's already the way that you've configured it, because it was already locally redundant storage. So it'll build out the template, go and compare it, and then it won't make any changes to the infrastructure that we've deployed. So, and I see a question there. So the ternary operator that we see here, the way that this works in your templates is we're saying, if this is true, then we do the first option. And if not, we do the second option here. And so you'll see that used quite a bit in Bicep templates. We could even go through and define some variables, which we'll do later. If we're doing some maybe more complex comparisons, we can do that logic in one place instead of a bunch of different places. So we'll take a look at that. But this gives us a complete Bicep template here that we could leverage. So this gets us through the process of actually getting to our deployment. And so if I go back and look here, we can see that this has completed. We're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the terminal. We're going to go and run a different command, because I mentioned to you earlier, I was going to show you about the different structure that you get with ARM templates versus with the structure that you get with Bicep. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run a different command now. I'm going to run a command. Hold on one second. We're going to run a command called Azure Bicep build, and we're going to pass in our file. So this is going to go through and create the JSON template based off of our Bicep file. Because here's the thing, Bicep is really just working with Azure Resource Manager and not replacing Azure Resource Manager. So if I go here, I can now grab this JSON file, and you can start to see what an ARM template would actually look like. So here we've got our schema defined. You can see that here's the parameters that we have defined, and here's the resources that we have defined. And this one here ends up being 39 lines of code versus, about 17. You're not going to notice a huge difference here, but when we get to larger templates, that's when you're really going to see a big difference. But also here, I kind of hope you can see that it's just a little bit easier when you're looking at a Bicep template to really go through and understand what's going on at first glance than it is an ARM-based JSON template. So I'm going to close that out. We're going to take a little bit of a breath here because we've gone through the process of completely deploying our first Bicep template. So here's the cool thing, right? In dealing with Bicep, like what I've shown you, it's a little bit easier to see and understand. It's a little bit, you have some additional work you can do, things that are more programmatic. All of that's true. But at the end of the day, one of the great benefits that we have with Bicep is it's very easy for us to go in and create these reusable modules. Now, there are some different ways that we can leverage modules, but here's what I want you to think of first with this. So what I want you to think of is that, let me go ahead and move here to this slide, is that modules really do enable you to create these infrastructure patterns. And one of the cool things about dealing with Azure Resource Manager in general is it handles dependency management. So we can create things that depend on other things, and it knows how to create the right order to create these resources in Azure. So we don't have to worry about all the complexity of orchestration that comes with that. And so this enables us to build these modules, then build dependencies between them and create these complete cloud solutions. So now I want to walk through and give you an example of how to do that. And I decided I originally was going to do this with a function app that we could build and deploy, but I kind of wanted to give you a direct comparison. In the last episode, we used container apps and we did it all through the portal. And I want to show you what it would be like if we said, you know what, let's go through and let's do some of this inside of Bicep. And then after that, let's figure out how we can automatically deploy some of this actually using GitHub Actions. So that's what we've got in store for the rest of the episode today. So let me go ahead and pull up VS Code again. And let me go ahead and get it so where you can actually see it. So here's what we had previously. I'm going to go ahead and shrink this just a little bit on the side. We're going to go through here and now create a new file. So I'm going to go through here and say new file. We're going to create one called container app env.bicep. Now, one of the things that we need to do when we're dealing with a container app is we need to create first a container app environment. And that's going to be that kind of logging and observability boundary for a container app. And multiple container apps can use one environment. So we're going to create this in a little module, and then we'll use it. And then we're going to have another module that we'll create for the container app itself. So let me go ahead and go back here to where you can see what we've got. So the first thing I'm going to do inside of here is I'm going to define some different parameters. And again, like I said, you're going to start to see things look a little bit more real here, like you would actually see in a true production implementation. So I'm seeing here that there is a quick question. Will there be any option to generate Bicep files from existing resources that I already have in case when I want to click everything in Azure portal, but then turn them into a reusable template? So you can go in and get the JSON definition for resources that you've created for Azure Resource Manager. I actually don't know, and this is a great question I need to look up. I don't know yet if they let you actually get the Bicep definition, but it doesn't matter either way, because what you can do is you can actually run a command called Azure Bicep, it's AZ Bicep, I think it's decompile, and that will actually take that ARM-based template and try to convert it over to Bicep. It might look a little funky when it's done, but it's going to be pretty close, and then you'll be able to work with that. So, I mean, long story short, kind of, it's maybe not as streamlined as it will be in the future, but it will help you get part of the way if you want to build some things there. However, I would encourage you, once you get working with Azure Bicep templates, I think you'll find that it's actually quite a bit faster to be able to work with Bicep once you get used to it than it is to go through and click things in the portal. So here we're defining a couple parameters. First, we're doing location. And since Container Apps is only available in certain Azure regions, we're just passing those in here. And so we're just going to allow those. So if for some reason we try to deploy it into a resource group that isn't one of those, it will let us know actually before we deploy. Also here, we're going to specify a name. And here we're using a function called unique string, and we're generating this based off of the resource group ID. So this gives us a great way to create a unique identifier. And here it's basically just going to hash that resource group ID and give us a value. So we're going to use that in both the name of the container app environment and the container app log analytics name. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we need to define a couple of resources. Now, again, I don't expect you to know these off the top of your head. The documentation kind of lets you know, and I'm also going to give you a link to the quick starts that Microsoft provides, so you'll have some references to go look at. But here we're going to create first a log analytics instance, and then we're going to do the container app environment, which references log analytics. So you can see here that we're actually passing in the log analytics configuration here in the container app environment, and that's what connects our two resources together. But I also want to do one other thing that we haven't done yet, and that is we're going to define something called an output. Now, outputs are what enable you to really have this level of reuse, because we're going to create a container app, and it's going to need to know what the ID is of the environment that it needs to be created in. So we can actually tell it, hey, use the output from this other module. That's going to be the information that you need. So outputs enable us to get access to things outside of the template that we define them in. In this case, container app env, and you can see here that we get that from the symbolic name that we have here for our container app environment, and then it returns an ID property. You might say, well, how do I know what it returns? Well, we can actually, again, use IntelliSense to actually look at the different values that are provided back from this particular resource, and we'll use ID. Great. So I'll save this one. Now we're going to go back. We're going to create another one. So I'm going to go now and create, not from template. I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this one container app.bicep. And just as before, we're going to go in and create some parameters. Now, don't freak out here. There's a lot of parameters, but I'm going to walk through them with you so that you understand what they're for. The first one we have here is name prefix. This is just going to be literally what it says. We're going to put it in front of the different names that we create. We then have container app name. And then we have one called Container App Environment ID. Now, you remember that I told you that we wanted to reference the other module that we created. So we're going to create this in a parameter. Now, we're not giving this parameter a default value. That means we'll have to define it when we deploy. And so by doing this, if for some reason we don't provide that, then we won't be able to deploy. It'll let us know that that's an error. So here, this is one of the ways you can use parameters. You can give default values that you can override, or you can simply say, nope, you have to define them when you deploy. And again, you do that either through the CLI, you can have it be interactive in those cases where you're using allowed values, or these are things that you can pass in. And I'll show you later, even when you're doing your GitHub action for deployment, you can pass in parameters there as well. Also here, we're doing the same thing that we did in the previous template, in that we're specifying an environment. We're either prod or dev. And then we're going to specify location. Again, the same options as we saw with our environment. And then we're going to do a container image. Now, just for the sake of testing, I am actually using a container image from our last episode. So let me go through and show this to you in case you want to leverage this directly. This is a repository I created. It actually was included in last month's repo as well, but I kind of broke it out into its own repository. This is a very simple Node.js demo that actually pulls real data on COVID cases worldwide by country and then gives an API so that you can query it. And I've deployed this utilizing GitHub packages. So we're actually using the public container repo with this. So this is what enables me to use this as just a public container image that I can pull. So that's what we're doing there. So I've just put this in as the default. Again, we're going to deploy multiples of these. We're not even really going to test that they're working. I just needed to have a container that we're going to deploy. Now, the next thing here, and this is a good example of where we're putting in default values for the number of minimum replicas and maximum replicas. And I'll show you in a minute how we connect this to the container app. But these are settings where, we can override these, even though we're saying that minimum replica is 0. Maybe we want the minimum to be 2, or maybe we want the minimum to be 5, right? And so by defining a value here, we're just saying, well, this is the default value, so we don't have to define it. But the maximum here, we're setting at 3. But again, it can be anywhere from 0 to 25. And you can see here that you can put in these min and max values. So we're actually validating the value of our parameters. And this gives us the ability to check that even before deployment time to make sure that we're including a value that it falls within those ranges. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to define here a variable. Now, a variable is truly a variable. It's different from a parameter. We're not going to pass this in. It's not going to be a configuration value. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying, well, here's going to be our different settings that are different between prod and dev. And these are going to be different CPU and memory settings for our container app. Now, since I have those defined, the next thing I can do is I can come in here and actually define the resource. So here we're creating our instance of a container app. We're saying, okay, we're going to pass in the name, the location, our environment ID, and then all the stuff that's specific to configuring our container, and then the things that are specific to configuring our container app name and the image. And then here's where you can see I'm actually leveraging those CPU and memory settings. So here we get to reference that environment. And so if it's prod, it's going to be one value. And if it's dev, it's going to be another value. And then you can see here after this, we're going to pass in our numbers for minimum and max replicas, and those values get passed in here as well. Now, just like with the other template, we're going to define one output, which is going to be the domain name that gets deployed with each of these. So here we go. We've actually got these 2 modules that we've defined. Now, we're going to go through in a minute and we're going to use these, but I want to tell you that there are some other places where you can actually get modules. So Microsoft has launched a public Bicep module repository. Right now, it is very, very limited. So I'm going to pull this up on my browser, but you can go here to Bicep registry modules, and there are several that have been created. You can see here that there are 7 by default, so you could actually use those. Now, there will be a lot more that's added in this. Right now, they've limited it so that only Microsoft employees can contribute. I hope at some point in the future, they're going to open this up. But see, here's the cool thing. Even if you don't use the ones from Microsoft, your organization can take these reusable elements of how you normally deploy infrastructure, create Bicep modules around them, and then really minimize the amount of custom configuration that you do when you deploy it. And you might say, well, okay, but how does that work? Let me show you. So we're going to go back here into VS Code. And what I want to do now is I want to go in and I actually want to implement this. So what I want to do, give me just a second here. We're going to go through and implement a new file. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and we're going to call this one modules.bicep. Now, what I want to do here is I want to show you how we use modules. So instead of just creating the resources like we've been doing, if we want to create these modules and then use them, what I need to do now is I need to say module instead of resource. I'm going to go ahead and say container app environment, because we want to use the module that we created for the environment. Now, what we need to do here, you can see we have IntelliSense locally, and I can select here container app env.bicep. That's what I want. So we're saying we want to create an instance of this. And here's the cool thing. Now that I've defined that module and I've added in those customization points with parameters, right? I only had to write that one time. Now, for me to go in and to create an environment, it's as simple as giving it a name, which in this case, we're going to say container app env. And then I need to actually then pass in a param, which in this case is just going to be location. And we'll say here location. Now, we know here that our location is going to be equal to our resource group location. So I'll put that at the top. Perfect. And that's all we need to do. So just with these 6 lines of code that we have, we can now define our environment because we've gone through the work here to lay out all the different configuration points for our container app environment. Great. So that's one way that we've actually implemented this module. But now let's look at how we could implement the next module as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste, one second. This needs to go here at the top. Perfect. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about how we now go in and create the actual container app itself. So here you can see I'm saying I want to create container app 1. That's what I'm calling it. And we're going to be referencing our container app.bicep file. I've given a name, and this is actually, I'll tell you this, when you create a module and then you deploy it, each module kind of goes through as a different deployment under a single deployment, but it actually happens separately. And so these names that we give these module instances, that's what actually becomes a deployment name. That'll make more sense when I show it to you in just a minute. So with this being said, this actually allows us to pass in the container image. Now we don't have to because we actually have a default value for this. So I could delete that. Also here, we can take location and we can actually replace that here with location. And environment here, we're actually going to be specifying here whether this is prod or dev. And then you'll notice here that we're referencing our environment ID by saying container app environment.outputs. And then we're saying container app environment ID. That's what we created when we did our output up in the previous one. But here's another cool thing. I don't just have to create one. I could create another container app from the exact same module. I could even go through and create a third one, right, if I wanted to. But I want to show you one thing with this third one. Here, I'm actually specifying what we call a conditional deployment. I'm saying here that what we want to do is we want to actually say that we only want this to deploy if the environment is equal to production. So let's pretend that for some reason we wanted to deploy 2 different container apps in dev, but 3 in production. Again, I realize this is a bit of a contrived example, but I just wanted to show you what's actually possible with this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we're going to go back to the terminal because I want to show you something else, right? Here's what I want to show you. I want to go ahead and build the ARM-based JSON template for this. So it's going to take it just a second to build this out. And now you can see we've got about 200 lines of code roughly between our container app environment, container app, and modules. But if I go look now at the generated modules.json file, I mean, this is going to be fairly epic in length in terms of what it's creating. We actually end up down here having about 646 lines to define this. And also, again, it becomes very difficult at a glance to really parse all the things that are included within this. It just gives you a little bit of a glimpse into why there is some difficulties in building ARM-based templates. Okay, so now that we have that in place, now that you've seen that, you might think, oh, this is the point where we deploy it. But no. We're not going to deploy this. Instead, we're going to let GitHub deploy this for us. Now, I want to have a conversation with you about how we do this. So let me go ahead really quick and bounce back up here to camera. So I'm going to show you the steps to actually go through and set up a specific a specific GitHub repository to work with the Azure Actions for GitHub. Now, to make this work, you're going to have to follow a set of instructions. Now, it's very difficult for me to keep some sensitive information off the screen when I'm live, so I've done a few things already. So let me go ahead and show you my screen here. So if I go here and I look under settings for this is just a private repository I'm working from, and I go under secrets and I go under actions, you'll see here that I've already defined 3 different secrets: Azure Credentials, Azure RG or Resource Group, and Azure Subscription. So these are all values. You might say, okay, well, how do I get those set up for me? Well, here's the cool thing. If I go to the repository that you have the link to for this episode, I actually have included a whole section here on adding in Azure Credentials for GitHub. And this will walk you through how you create a service principal, the values that you need to put into GitHub, and what it should even look like when you're done, which is, again, the settings that I just showed you, how that's properly configured. So that's what you can follow through, and you can do those steps. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to go back over here, and we're going to create another new file. Actually, I take that back. Before I do that, I want to create another resource group. So we're going to create one called CBL May 22 GitHub, also with an East US location. And I'm also going to go through and choose to delete the previous group that we were working with. And so we don't need to worry about that. That'll just kind of go on in the background for now. So I'll go back over here to VS Code, and now we're going to create another new file. So here, and this is just a little secret if you didn't know this, you can actually pass in an entire path across multiple directories here, and if they aren't created, they'll be created for you. So here we're creating a file under .github and workflows called deploy.yml. Now this, because I chose deploy, it's going to tell me there's multiple schemas, and I'm just going to tell it here I only care about the GitHub workflow schema. So what we want to do here is we want to define an action that will run, that will deploy for us. Now let's talk about why you would want to do this. So when you're working within a team, and let's say you're building out a cloud-based application, and maybe you have a couple of repos, one for like your front-end application that gets built into a container, and another one that's actually the infrastructure. You want these things to be continuously delivered. And so instead of making these things manual steps, and especially instead of manually going in and clicking within the portal, you can automate the process of deployment. Now, if you haven't had a lot of experience with GitHub Actions, they are phenomenal. What you can do is specify that GitHub should take certain actions when you push code to either certain branches, or you do releases, or there's all sorts of configurations there. So I want to show you, based on some of the information that Microsoft has provided, how we actually would go in and define an action that would deploy a Bicep file. So let me go back here and show you my screen again. I'm going to go here under deploy. And here we're creating our workflow. It's going to say here that whenever we push to the main branch, and main is the name of the default branch that I use within Git, and we're going to do several steps under an action called deploy bicep. First of all, we're going to check out the repository, which is going to get us the code that we've pushed. We're then going to do Azure login. And this is an action, again, that we can see here because of the Azure namespace. This is provided by Microsoft. But here we're going to pass in our Azure credentials. And this links back to our service principal. This is what's going to give us the ability to actually perform that deployment. Then after that, we're going to run arm deploy. Now, again, as I told you, Bicep works with, it actually works with Azure Resource Manager. So we can use arm deploy here for this. We just need to pass in our subscription, our resource group, and the template file, which in this case is going to be modules.bicep, the one that we just created. Now you'll notice here, I told you that even in our GitHub action, we could define parameters. And so here we'll say environment is equal to dev. And so we have now our workflow defined. Now, if we go back and look at modules.bicep, because we specified here that this third container app should only deploy if environment is equal to production, then we should only see it deploy an environment and then two different container apps. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and save all of this. It's all saved. And now I'm actually going to add this into the repository. So we will say commit for workflow. And we'll stage all of those and then sync them. Perfect. Now I'm going to go over into my browser, and I'm going to go here under the repository. And if I go under actions, we can see that this is indeed already running. We see our commit for workflow. Now here we can see that it's running deploy bicep. And if we go into this, we can actually see the different steps that it's going to take. So it's going to take it just a second to actually get this running. So while this is running, this is a great time. If you all have any questions and you haven't entered them in yet, feel free to go ahead and enter them in, because I would love to be able to address any of the questions you have about anything with infrastructure as code. Oh, and I see I do have a failure here. Let me take a look and see what happened. Oh, okay, hold on one second here. Got one thing I'll fix. Again, this is for you guys to be entering in questions. Okay, we're rerunning that here. So any questions at all? Where's everybody coming from? Could always ask that question. Oh, so somebody's about to start AZ900. Awesome. Awesome. That is great, because that is really obviously the fundamentals, getting to know the fundamentals. That is amazing. So we've got obviously a lot of great resources to get you past that. Hopefully, again, yeah, I see here the comment as well. I hope you are astonished in a good way towards what's possible with this. Any other questions? Do you need to be a developer or need to write code for getting into DevOps? Now, that is a great question. And with this, I think the answer to this is, to some extent, yes. You need to have some knowledge of code. And so while you might not be building massive applications, for example, if you're in DevOps, your ability to script actions and your ability to use templates, like that's going to be very, very central towards what you want to do. So I think, again, I would advise you to certainly spend some time going through and learning some bits of code that you can leverage as a part of DevOps. That is fairly important. Any other questions? Cool. Well, very good. So here's a couple things I want to actually just run through with you guys here at the end, because you've seen everything from creating a workflow and creating single templates, creating multiple templates. You've seen the deployment process happen all the way through with GitHub. You've seen it happen just locally via the CLI. So I think we've been able to hit through a lot of different things here within this episode. So I hope you've enjoyed the ability to do this. I hope you go in and actually take a look at the GitHub repository and that you go through and try some of this on your own, because you have access to everything that we've talked about here. So if I go look, for example, I'm going to pull this up. And show you my screen again. So if you take a look at this here, you have examples for the GitHub workflow. You can see how we've configured that. You can go through and look at the container app and the whole module setup we did, and this just storage file that we did, and we created a storage account. All of that is there and available to you. So here's what I would ask you to do. I would ask you to take time to build your own solutions with Azure Bicep, and then let us know how it goes for you. We honestly want to hear how you're doing. So you can feel free to leave comments. You can feel free to post. You can feel free to connect with us on Discord. We have a specific channel in there for Cloud Builder Live, and we want to hear more from you all and the experiences that you have. So again, if nobody has any other questions, let me see here if there's any others. Cool. I don't see any others. So thank you for joining us this month. Again, be sure to stay tuned. We're going to have some GCP content coming up. We're definitely going to have more Azure in the future as well. But I'm glad that you joined me here for the May episode of Cloud Builder Live from Pluralsight and a Cloud Guru.